The wind came in like a warning low and sharp and endless. Silas Gable had felt it in his bones before he saw the sky change. Cold front, fierce and fast, sweeping down off the mountains with that hard edge winter carried this far west. He'd just finished checking the corral, his coat stiff with frost, when he noticed something off near the barn. At first he thought it was a pile of old feed sacks, the kind wind sometimes tossed about the pasture. But it didn't sit right, too still, too shaped. He walked over slow, boots sinking into snow crust, and crouched. The shape didn't move. Then he saw the hair dark, tangled, flecked with ice. A girl, young, face down in the snow. Arms curled protectively around something her belly. Pregnant, her dress was torn at the hem and stained with mud. Her shawl barely more than a rag across her shoulders. Her lips were blue. Silas didn't. Kirst didn't cry out, just exhaled a long breath into the silence. Then bent down and lifted her like a sack of wet flour. He hadn't carried anyone in years. Not since his wife June had died gasping in that same winter wind. But his arms remembered. His back didn't protest. He took her inside. The cabin was old and plain. Wood stove crackling low, coffee still hot in the pot, one bed made with thick wool quilts, and the faint scent of lavender left in the linens from another time. Silas laid her on it, rough but careful. Her face was pale beneath the bruises. She moaned once and then went quiet again. He sat in the chair beside the hearth, the one with a cracked leg he kept meaning to fix. The fire cast long shadows across. The floor, he didn't touch her again. Didn't ask who she was or where she came from. Just stoked the flame and poured himself coffee into the tin mug he'd used every morning for 15 years. Outside, the wind battered the windows, rattling, the shutters like fists on a coffin. Silas drank in silence and watched her breathe. Night dragged on, slow and brittle. He didn't sleep. He hadn't planned to. He watched her belly rise and fall, watched the way her fingers curled into the blanket like she was still running in. Her dreams. At one point, he reached down and tucked the shawl better over her shoulders, then returned to his chair. By morning, the wind had died some, though the frost still painted the glass. The girl stirred with a soft whimper, eyelids fluttering open. Her gaze moved slowly, taking in the room, the fire, and then him. "You brought me in?" she said, voice hoarse, like gravel scraped over wood. Silas didn't move. "You were about to die out there." She blinked at the fire, then back to him. I didn't think anyone lived this far out." He said nothing. She sat up with effort, wincing as she adjusted her belly, now fully visible beneath her coat. "I'll go soon. I'll just need a day or two. Then I'll be out of your way." Silas stood. "Stay till you can walk proper. Then, you move on." She nodded. Didn't beg. Didn't cry. Later that day, she found a broom and began to sweep the dust from the floorboards. Silas didn't stop her. He chopped wood outside and stacked it higher than usual by the door. Sure why when he came back in, she had boiled water and cleaned her face. Her hair was still wild, but her eyes clearer. He noticed then her hands. They were red and raw, nails chipped, not hands made for running. She saw him looking. "Name's Mira," she said, quiet but steady. He didn't offer his own. "I can. Pull my weight," she added. "I don't expect handouts." Silas poured another cup of coffee. Didn't answer. But when he set the tin mug down, he poured one for her too. She accepted it, wrapping her fingers around it like it was the first. Warmth she'd touched in weeks. That night, he took the chair again, and she laid on the bed. This time, she didn't fall asleep right away. She watched the fire, then him. "You live here alone?" He nodded once. She hesitated. "How long?" "Too long." She didn't ask more. Outside, snow drifted down in quiet sheets. The wind had softened, but the cold remained lingering like grief. Inside, two strangers sat beneath the low-timbered roof. A girl without a home. A man without a reason to speak. They didn't talk again that night, but they stayed. The snow outside had softened to a gentle hush, blanketing the fields in silence. Inside the cabin, the days grew long and slow, marked by the creak of floorboards. the dull rhythm of work, and the low murmur of the fire. Mira moved carefully, as if testing the edges of her welcome, never lingering too close, never pressing too far. She swept the floor with a straw broom worn to its spine, scooped ashes from the hearth, and chopped kindling with effort her shoulders. Tight breath short, she winced when she twisted wrong, or when the baby shifted sharply inside her, but she never complained, never asked for help. Silas watched. From the porch, from his chair, from behind the brim of his old hat. He noticed things he didn't want to notice, the way her hands trembled when she thought no one was looking, how she flinched when the wind slammed the back door. He saw how her eyes turned glassy in the evenings, staring past the firelight, like she was listening for someone who never came. One morning, she wandered into the corner of the barn where his old workbench sat, gathering dust. Silas was mending fence posts outside, but he saw her through the gap in the door. Myra stood there, still as death, her hand hovering over the wall. Hanging on a rusted nail, wrapped in red ribbon, was a braid of brown hair. His wife's Mira didn't touch it, not at first. Just stood there, her own loose hair tangled across her shoulders. Then, as if drawn by something ancient and aching, she reached out and let her fingers graze it. She didn't know he was watching. That night after supper, they sat in their usual silence. The fire popped inside. Mira stared into it, her hands folded over her belly, her eyes darker than before. "It was a settler's boy," she said, voice barely above the crackle. "Used to leave wildflowers outside my mother's window. Promised me Colorado. Promised me a cabin and a rocking chair." Silas said nothing. Myra smiled without warmth. "His father found out. Said I was a stain on the family. Said I wasn't pure stock. Next week he married some girl with clean hands and no belly." The wind rattled softly in the chimney. Mira didn't look at him. "My mother always said men don't know how to hold what's real, just what shines." Silas reached for the poker, stirred the embers. He could have said something, could have told her men like that weren't worth the memory. But he didn't. Words had long stopped meaning much to him. Later that night, long after Mira had gone to bed, Silas sat alone at the kitchen table. Her shawl was draped over the back of the chair, torn and muddied, a thread hanging loose at the seam. He looked at it a long while. Then he got his needle, his thread, and sat by lamplight, patching it slow. In the morning, she found it folded. Neatly at the edge of her bed, she didn't say a word. Just ran her fingers over the stitch like it meant something more than thread. The cabin held its silence like an old friend. But something in that silence had changed. It was no longer cold. It was waiting. That week, Mira asked to help with the fence, and Silas didn't stop her. She held the posts while he hammered, despite the snow soaking her boots. They didn't talk much, but she stood her ground in the biting wind, and he felt something settle inside him he hadn't realized was loose. At night, she sat by the hearth and hummed to the baby. Old lullabies he didn't recognize. No, not English. Something softer, older. He didn't ask about her mother or her people. Not yet. But he listened. Also started watching the door more. The thought of someone from her past, or were stitched at the back of his neck. That nervous tick he hadn't had since the war came back. Started sleeping with the rifle beside the door again. Told himself it was habit. One evening, Mira stood near the window and stared out across the white plain. Her breath fogged the glass. "Why do you stay here?" she asked, her voice quiet. Silas didn't answer. She turned to him, arms wrapped around her belly. It's not just the cold, it's the stillness. It's like this place forgot how to live." He rubbed his hands together, his fingers thick with callus. "It's not meant to be lively." Mira gave a tired half-smile. "No, I suppose." "It's not." Then she walked past him, her scent like cedar and ash, and went to bed. Later that night, Silas stood by the workbench. The braid was still there, still tied with June's red ribbon. He thought about taking it down, burying it maybe, but his hands didn't move. Instead, he lit a lantern and sat outside. The snow was starting again, drifting slow and steady over the porch. In the distance, coyotes called. He watched the barn, watched the darkness. Thought about the girl sleeping just feet away and the child that would soon arrive. He didn't want her. Here didn't ask for this. But something in her, the way she faced the cold without apology, the way she didn't cry when most would have begged, had begun to stir the places in him he'd left untouched. Some ghosts stayed quiet until the fire burned just right. And now the coals were glowing again. Ask ChatGPT. The storm didn't come gently. It screamed over the ridge at dawn, dragging a sky the color of leaden clouds so low they looked like they might scrape the earth clean. By mid-morning, the wind had turned mean, curling around the cabin like a starving wolf. Snow didn't fall so much as it attacked, coming in sideways sheets that stung the windows and buried the fences faster than Silas could think. By noon, the land was gone, just white in every direction. The barn vanished into the curtain not 20 feet away. Silas worked fast. Water was boiled, logs stacked high, the mule brought inside the lianto with a grain sack for company, sealed the door cracks with cloth, and hung blankets over the back window. When he came back in, Myra was on her knees near the stove, doubled over, one hand braced on the floor, the other clutched around her belly. He dropped the pail and crossed to her in 2 strides. "Breathe," he said, voice rough, more bark. "Then bomb? Tell me what's happening." "I don't." She sucked in a ragged breath, sweat on her brow despite the cold. "It started hurting, then stopped, then came back." "False labor," he muttered, or so he hoped. He fetched more blankets and spread one on the floor near the fire, helped her lower down with his arms under hers. She was shivering. Whether from pain or fear he couldn't tell. Mira stared at the flames. "I'm not ready yet. I can feel it's not time." Silas nodded once, then moved to heat more water, hands shaking harder than he liked. It had been years since he'd seen a woman in labor, never without a midwife or June. He was folding another quilt when the knock came. 3 sharp raps. Not the wind. Not chance. Silas straightened, his body stiffening with a kind of knowing that didn't come from thought. He crossed the room, rifle already in hand, and opened the door just a slit. Snow swirled in like breath, and standing on the porch, face red from cold and eyes smug beneath the brim of his lawman's hat, stood Deputy Marshal Owen Crane. "Well now," Crane said, brushing snow off his shoulders. "Ain't this cozy?" Silas didn't answer, just stared. Crane glanced past him into the room. His eyes landed on Mira, curled on the floor, pale and breathing heavy. "She's a long way from town," he said, stepping closer. "Folk been looking for that one? Got herself into a bit of trouble down south. I figure I'll take her off your hands." "No," Silas said, voice low and hard. Crane raised a brow. "Beg your pardon? She stays." For a beat, no one spoke. Even the storm seemed to pause. Crane took another step, boots crunching on the porch. "You harboring a fugitive, Silas?" Silas didn't flinch. "I'm harboring a human being." Inside, Myra had gone quiet. She stared at the 2 men, her face unreadable, but her hands gripping the blanket like it might carry her away. Crane spat into the snow. "You know what she is? A half-blood whore who seduced the wrong man and cried wolf when he turned her loose. Word is, her kind play victim when it suits them." Silas didn't move. Didn't even blink. Then, slowly, he pushed the door shut. Crane's voice came through the wood. "This ain't over, old man." Silas barred the door, locked it, then turned and looked at Mira. She met his gaze, eyes full of something that was not quite fear, and not quite hope. "You didn't ask why he was looking for me," she whispered. "Didn't have to," he said. He sat up straighter, wincing. "You believe me?" "I don't need to." He picked up the rifle and set it beside the hearth. "But you stay?" Something passed between them, then quiet, warm, fleeting like embers in a windstorm, but it was there. That night the storm howled so hard it made the walls groan. Snow piled. Halfway up the door they couldn't sleep. Mira curled close to the fire, wrapped in every blanket she owned, and Silas sat beside her, pouring hot water over cloths and checking her breathing every few minutes. She didn't cry. "Complain you ever delivered a child?" she asked sometime near midnight, out alone. She smiled faintly, the kind of smile you give when there's nothing left to lose. "Guess we'll learn together." The fire crackled between them. Outside, the storm raged without mercy. But inside, something had shifted. Myra watched him from under her shawl. You didn't have to stand up for me. Silas looked into the flames. Neither did you deserve to be run off like a stray. The cabin held its breath. In the silence and the glow of the fire, Silas saw her not as a burden but as someone broken like him. Something deep, long buried, opened. He would not let her be discarded again. Ask ChatGPT. The storm didn't pass so much as it settled into their bones. It stayed for days, folding the world into silence. The snow swallowed fences, buried paths, and turned the sky to a gray canvas that never moved. Inside the cabin, time stretched. Thin, marked only by the hiss of the fire and the creak of floorboards, as Myra moved slowly from hearth to window and back again. Silas chopped what little wood he had left under the lean-to and kept the stove going through the worst of it. The cold was a living thing, pressing at the windows, trying to get in, but it never quite reached them. Not fully. Not with the fire burning and the quiet between them growing warmer by degrees. Myra had taken to humming, low songs in a language Silas didn't recognize, soft and full of old ache. He didn't ask about them. He just listened. The sound of it reminded him of wind threading through cottonwood trees or creek water over stone. Something older than either of them, she caught. Him listening once, and her humming stopped. Their eyes met across the room. Comanche, she said after a pause. My mother's blood. Silas nodded. He didn't flinch, didn't offer apology or pity, just met her gaze and gave her silence that meant something different than before. Myra smiled just slightly and turned back to the fire. That night, as wind scratched softly at the walls, Myra opened a cedar chest near the bedroom door. Inside lay folded linens, faded quilts, and beneath them, wrapped in wax paper, a wedding dress. The lace had yellowed. The hem was torn at the back. She held it up, careful with the seams, her breath catching at the weight of it. Silas stood in the doorway, one hand resting on the frame. She wore it just once, he said. His voice had a rough edge, but not from anger. Myra looked at him over the fabric. She must have been beautiful. She was. There was nothing else said. She folded it gently and put it back the way she found it, like placing a prayer back in the Bible. The wind whistled down the chimney. Outside, the world remained white and soundless. Inside, the fire cast their shadows across the wood walls. Stretched and warm. Later, as she sat sewing the rip in her shawl, Myra spoke without looking up. I don't know how to raise a baby. I never had anyone show me. My mama died when I was 13. I've been running since. Silas didn't answer right away. He stirred the fire, then sat in his usual chair. You don't have to raise her alone, he said finally. Myra's hand paused on the thread. I wasn't expecting that, she said, her voice barely above the crackle of the flame. Neither was I. The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was soft, expectant. Like the space between snowflakes. She finished her stitching and placed the shawl over the back of the rocker. Then, slowly, she eased herself into the old wooden chair. It groaned beneath her sommeil as it always had. She laid her hands over her belly, adjusting herself with care, her back to the fire, but her face turned toward Silas. You always sit on that side of the porch, she said. He nodded. It's where her chair was. Habit. Some habits are holy. Silas didn't reply, but something in his face softened. That night, as the fire burned low, Silas stood and moved the rifle to its old spot beside the door. He hadn't needed it yet, but something about the storm's stillness made him uneasy. He checked the lock, the latch, and the snow-packed threshold. Then he looked back. Myra hadn't gone to the bed. She stayed in the rocker, curled beneath her patched shawl, one hand gently stroking her stomach. Her eyes were closed, but not tightly. Her breath even, the way a person rests when they feel safe. He didn't disturb her, just sat in his chair again and watched the embers glow, dim and steady. At some point before dawn, the wind stopped entirely. Not faded, stopped. Like the land itself had drawn breath and held it, Silas rose and cracked the door an inch. Snow was piled against it, but the stars were visible, sharp frozen things in a black sky. The world outside still looked dead. But something inside the cabin was alive again. When he turned back, Mira was awake. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her eyes met his with a calm that hadn't been there before, and he nodded once. Like a man answering a question without words, she was not afraid. Not anymore. The thaw came slow. It's a kind of melt that whispered rather than ran. The kind that left behind patches of hard snow and deep mud. The chicken stirred again, restless in the warming light, and Mira began moving with more purpose. She gathered eggs with a hand to her back, sewed up tears in Silas's coat with steady fingers, and made coffee every morning before he came in from the barn. Silas let her. That alone said enough. They didn't talk much. But things passed between them in quiet ways. A cup set gently on the table. Boots left to dry near the fire. A hat handed over without a word when the sun hit too hard. One morning, as she worked, a stubborn tear in the shoulder seam of his shirt, Myra said something that made herself la fa dry. Sudden burst that seemed to surprise her more than it did him. Silas had looked up from his coffee, blinking. Mira clapped a hand over her mouth, eyes wide, and lowered it slowly, a bit embarrassed. "Sorry," she said. "It's been a while since anything was funny." Silas didn't smile, but his eyes lingered. "Don't stop," he said. Later, that day, he showed her how to fire the old .22 from the back stoop. The butt of it pressed awkwardly into her shoulder. She fired twice, both shots wide of the mark, and grumbled under her breath. "You're bracing too late," he said. "I'm trying," she said. He stepped behind her, close enough to adjust her arms but not touch her. Just his voice low and warm. "Don't try. Just aim." She hit the tin can on the next shot. Her face lit up. When she went to town for salt and flour a few days later, Silas handed her something wrapped in oilskin. She opened it on the porch. A folded shawl, soft and old, smelling of cedar and hearth smoke, was hers, he said. "Figured you might need it more." Myra didn't speak, just nodded and wrapped it around her shoulders. It hung long over her belly, the fringe brushing her hips. They rode the mule into town, Myra sitting tall despite the stairs. Quiet, but not quiet enough. A man spat near her feet and muttered, "Half-blood carrying a bastard. Shame." Mira didn't flinch, but her hands tightened on the reins. Silas stood beside her, broad and silent eyes sharp under his hat. He didn't speak, didn't threaten, just stood there until the man turned away. That said enough. Back at the cabin, the sky had turned to iron. A storm rolled in. But not of snow. This one came with heat and thunder, clouds rolling black across the ridge. Mira moved slower that day, her hands pressing to her lower back. Her breath grew shallow by sundown. She was sweeping when it started. A gasp, a rush of water. The broom clattered to the floor. Silas turned from the hearth, eyes widening. "It's time," Mira whispered. He moved fast, laid out blankets, heated the wire, fetched the knife, and boiled it. Her pain came in waves, each one dragging her under, and Silas sat behind her, letting her lean against him, strong hands bracing her through every cry. She bit her lip, screamed once into his shirt. He didn't flinch. "Breathe," he said. "Just breathe." Thunder cracked outside, loud and long. At dawn, the baby came. A girl, small, red-faced, alive. Silas held her, wrapped in a quilt that once belonged to his wife. His hands shook, but not from fear. He looked at Mira, exhausted and tearful, her skin damp with sweat and light. "She's beautiful," he said. Mira nodded, her throat tight. "She's ours now." He placed the child in her arms. Mira cried. Then, but not from pain. From something else. From relief. From grace. From finally being allowed to stay. Outside, the ground was still frozen in places. But inside, fire hadn't gone out. And in the soft breath of that newborn cry, the house was no longer just shelter, it was home. The frost had returned by the time the riders came. Not a storm this time, but men. hooves stirring dust where snow had melted, leather coats dark against the gray sky, and Deputy Crane leading them with the same sneer he always wore like a badge. His hand rested too casually on the butt of his pistol, the others behind him looking half ashamed to be there, half ready to draw. Silas was already outside when they crested the ridge, standing just past the porch rail, rifle held low but firm. He didn't speak, didn't shift his weight. Just waited. Mira stood inside the doorway, the baby in her arms wrapped in the cedar-scented shawl. Her fingers trembled, but her eyes were clear, watching, listening. The child stirred softly against her chest. A small sigh from a life untouched. By what loomed, Crane pulled his horse to a stop at the edge of the yard. "Gable," he said, "we've been patient. But that girl's past caught up with her. Words come down from Fort Dawson. She's wanted for harboring herself under a false name. Fraud. Obstruction." Silas didn't blink. "She told you her name." Crane's jaw twitched. "She told you lies." Behind Silas, the porch creaked. Myra stepped forward, the baby cradled tight against her ribs. Her voice, when it came, was neither soft nor sharp, was steady. "I told the truth," she said. "Just not the one you wanted to hear." Crane turned his eyes to her. "You're not the law here." "No," she said. "But I live here." Silence. Swept across the yard like a cold wind. Mira didn't falter. "Your law didn't protect me when he forced himself on me. It didn't protect my mother when settlers torched our village and called it progress. You want to drag me back to that? Go ahead. But the girl you're chasing, she died out there in the snow. The woman standing here now, she's built something right here, with these hands." Crane looked to the men behind him. Their eyes didn't meet his. Mira took a breath, not to plead, but to finish. "You can't erase that just because it makes you uncomfortable." The baby whimpered. Mira rocked her gently. Crane narrowed his eyes at Silas. "You standing with her, Silas?" Didn't hesitate. "I am." A long pause hung in the cold. Crane's horse shifted. The men behind him looked between each other, then at the child, then at Myra. No one reached for their guns. No one dismounted. Crane spat in the dirt. "This is a mistake." "Then ride on," Silas said. And Crane did. They all did. Not fast. Not ashamed, but quieter than they came. When the sound of hoofbeats faded, Myra's knees nearly gave, but she held firm. She turned and Silas was already there, arms out, taking the baby from her without a word. He held the girl against his shoulder, rocking gently, one hand cupping the back of her tiny head. Mira leaned into the doorway, catching her breath. No tears came. Not now. Not after all that, just stillness. Knowing later that evening, the sun dropped behind the ridge and painted the sky in bruised gold. The land exhaled. A wind moved slow through the dry brush, no longer bitter. Myra sat on the porch step, combing through her hair with her fingers. She began to braid it slowly, carefully, each loop tight, each strand wrapped with intention. The same way her mother taught her when the world still made sense. Beside her, the old rocking chair creaked softly. Silas sat back, boots planted. Firm, the baby asleep in his arms, her small hand resting against his chest. He looked out toward the horizon, toward the path Crane had taken. Didn't say a thing. He didn't need to. The braid slipped over Myra's shoulder. She tied it off with a strip of faded red ribbon from the drawer, the one that it held. June's memory, until now, night eased over the hills. Inside the cabin, the fire waited. The cradle sat ready. A pot of coffee rested on the stove. Still. Warm dot outside. Two souls who once thought themselves too broken to be known sat in a silence full of meaning, and neither of them rode away.